Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome to GZERO Media's presentation of the Eurasia Group's famed top risks of 2023. I'm Evan Solomon. I'm the publisher of GZERO Media, and it is great to be here. Now, as you know, each year, Eurasia Group team produces a forecast of the biggest global political risks most likely to play out in the coming months. They're the storylines that will shape policy decisions and politics and power dynamics around the world. Now, over the course of the next hour, we will reveal Eurasia Group's top risk list, what they are and why, and we'll dive into a few of the most important themes and dynamics that will shape the year ahead. And at the end, of course, we will reveal the top risk of 2023 and what it means for the year ahead. You'll hear directly from the people and the experts whose research informed this work, beginning, of course, with the masterminds behind the report. That is, of course, Ian Bremmer, the president of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media, and Cliff Kupchan, the Eurasia Group chairman. Cliff, Ian, you've been at this already all day. Welcome. Happy New Year. Good to see you both.
Happy New Year, dude.
Yeah, it's good to see you. And I know you've probably got the big mug of coffee because there's a lot of interest in this. Ian, let me just start with you. And let's just start at 30,000 feet at the big picture. In the new top risks report, there's this kind of general overwhelming dynamic. On one side, it seems positive. The pandemic's ending. NATO and the EU are more united. Renewable energy is getting cheaper. But then the report says, wait a second, there's a counterweight on uncertainty due to what the report says are a small group of individuals who have amassed an extraordinary amount of power and are driving a concerning set of risks and uncertainties. Ian, let's just talk about that. How are these two dynamics shaping the risks of 2023?
Maybe start negative since it's top risks. It's aging autocrats and tech bros. This is what we're looking at. It's a small number of people in very different environments who have the willingness and capacity to disrupt the global environment in ways that we are not predicting, ways that we are not ready for. And yet, they have very little constraints, no checks and balances on their power internally in their environments, in their systems, in their institutions. And they also don't have a lot of expertise that is getting through to them. So in a sense, it's the opposite of the Donald Trump factor in the United States. So many people were concerned that democracy was falling apart, but irrespective of how unfit he may have been for office, he had all sorts of checks and balances that prevented him from either implementing policies that would break the train or to steal the election, for example, and the whole January 6th thing. That we're now seeing, on the one hand, the United States, the European Union, Brazil, major democracies in the world have a lot more resilience and stability than people had been expecting. And that's true of international institutions as well, like the G7 and NATO. And yet this small group of incredibly powerful rogues are driving more geopolitical uncertainty and risk that at any point since we started the firm 25 years ago.
You got the tech bros, and we'll talk more about that later, and the aging autocrats. I think that's a pretty good formulation. Cliff, because it's top risks, as Ian says, let's stick with the negative because there are some startling warnings in the report. I'll just read one. War. There is a potential for mutually assured destruction due to accidents and miscalculations that will be higher in 2023 than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62, which is pretty startling. And then on the economic side, and everybody watching is feeling that already, quote, the combination of high inflation, rising interest rate, and insufficient fiscal support will push the global economy into recession. So, people are paying attention now. What are the forces driving these two risks? And also, Cliff, how are they interconnected?
The forces driving the war risk are really Mr. Putin, who made the mother of all bad decisions. Ian talks about bad decisions. This is probably the worst one. I mean, he obviously had horrible information. He thought he was going to be greeted as a victor, roses, nothing like that. The nuclear standoff, I think, ultimately is underpinned by the fact that there's no good climb down here. There is no way that Putin can withdraw, give up like Khrushchev did in 1962, and still keep his job and if not his life. So that's ultimately what makes it really, really scary. I think it's also really scary because the Ukrainians may well succeed in cutting the land bridge, from the Donbass to Crimea. And then, this guy could use a tactical nuclear weapon. My Russian friends are really scared. And they're not just saying that to spin me. These guys don't spin me. They're really scared. So that's on the nuclear side. I think on the inflation side, look, inflation, energy, and human development. We have three risks that are really driven by a trilogy of shocks: the war in Ukraine, the pandemic, and the inflation shock. And that really ties together. That's the second kind of thing that ties together a lot of the risks. Inflation, which Rob will talk about, higher inflation than countries have seen in years and years and years. We think that global recession, US recession. On the energy side, high energy prices, a big contributor to inflation. Going to drive a lot of OPEC US tensions. Bad US-Saudi relationship will get spiked. A lot of knock-on effects there. And then human development. Who really pays for these things? It's a big K-curve effect going on. When the ultimate bill goes to poor people who are going to get poorer from what's going on. So I think, Evan, that's kind of the second thread, let's say, that ties a bunch of these risks together.
Yeah, Cliff, I'm going to come back to the trilogy of shocks, which is another thing to pay attention to, driving that. But kind of interesting. And as Ian said, we're focusing on the risks, but it was interesting ahead of this live stream. GZERO Media surveyed social media followers following a couple of key themes that we are discussing today as we outline the top risks. And we're calling it kind of the outlook. How full is the glass? Are people optimistic or pessimistic? So we asked this question, and let's throw up the poll here. Compared to 2022, I expect 2023 to be A, better, B, worse, or about the same. Now, this is a really interesting result. Check this out. Here's how people voted. Compared to 2022, 45% of people said they expect it to be better, which I thought was a pretty fascinating number, higher than I thought. 28% said worse, and about the same 27%. So I guess if you add up about the same and worse, it's a little more. But I'll flip to you. What do you make of this quick poll of our social media that 45% of people think, actually, I think it's going to get better?
Pandemic is a really big piece of it. For the majority of the world, 2023 will feel as if the pandemic is in the rearview mirror. And I think most people expect that to be the case. It's been so enormously disruptive, and not necessarily economically disruptive, but fear that, you can't do what you want to do. You can't see your loved ones. You can't travel. You can't go out. You don't know what your job's going to be like, what your school's going to be like, all that stuff. So the fact that you are trying to find normalcy again, that perception, I think, will drive an awful lot of people to say, yeah, they think it's getting better. But there are a lot of don't knows there. And I have to say that the level of uncertainty around 2023, for me, as someone who has devoted their entire lives to trying to understand what are the major forces that are affecting the world around us, so much of the risk this year comes from individuals who want to disrupt our environment. They want to make the world worse for us as we perceive it. And yet we can't really do a lot to change their thinking. We can't do a lot to constrain them. We can't do a lot to stop them. And I do think that the powerlessness drives a lot of anxiety. And we are going to be in a world where increasingly large numbers of people feel like they don't have access to the ability to make decisions for themselves and their loved ones. That I think is one of the biggest concerns out there.
Okay, I got about a minute here, Cliff, before we get to the top risks. But I just want to remember last year, Ian mentioned COVID. The top risk was China's zero COVID policy. Also last year, Cliff, you talked about the geopolitical recession, lack of leadership from the US, and the polarization in that country. When you're just real quick on these two forces, they have not ended despite the end of the pandemic, as Ian talked about. How are they playing out in the year ahead?
I think we're on our way out of the pandemic, as Ian said. depending on where you sit. I mean, some countries aren't. China's gonna have a rough time getting out, but I think we're on our way out. The geopolitical recession continues to deepen. It's structural. It flows from G0, that no country or group of countries has, the ability and the willingness to lead the global order. It's not going to happen. So that's going to keep going. I think in climate, in technology, those sorts of spheres, we're not going to see much cooperation or agreement. What is interesting, though, is that in the security sphere, we're still kind of in a unipolar world. And the war has made it very clear that, you dial white in at 1-800 Washington when you get a land war in Europe. And that's not necessarily something that I would have expected to see.
Okay, Cliff and Ian, hang in there. We'll bring you back, of course, over the next hour. I want to bring in some of the other experts who were part of this report. And let's actually get in to the top risks of 2023. We're going to build this from 10 to 1 in terms of top risks, and we'll find some common themes. On the back half of the list, there are a few risks. I think these are related, so let's group them together. Risk number 10, water stress. That focuses on water scarcity and the geopolitical threats that water scarcity will create. But then it's actually related to risk number 7, which is arrested global development. That addresses the deep setbacks to global development that we've all experienced since 2020, millions more people in poverty, the widening equality gap, and of course, regression on climate policy. And then you've got risk 6, the energy crunch, which is about the growing energy crisis, particularly in Europe, which we've talked about so much. So this grouping is all essentially themed around the energy issue and climate change, which is why I want to bring in Franck Gbaguidi, our senior analyst for climate, energy, and resources at EG, to dig in further. First of all, Franck, Happy New Year. Awesome to see you. I think everyone expected energy to be the top risk of 2023, given the war in Ukraine, the energy shortages in places like Europe. I think the big one that surprised me anyway was putting water on the list. Why did water scarcity make a top risk in 2023?
Thanks, Ivan. I mean, what would be a top risk list without a surprise, right? Especially for 25th anniversary. No, but more seriously, you're right. I think it will come as a surprise to most. And that's really because people take it for granted. I mean, more than 70% of the planet is covered by water, but see, only 3% of it is fresh water. Companies take it for granted too. Most of them underestimate the cost of water by 3 to 5 times its actual true cost. And then to make matters worse, policymakers are either ignoring or not responding adequately to the problem. So while we've been ignoring the issue just kept growing. We just crossed the 8 billion people mark, which means huge water needs. And at the same time, climate change is making water scarce. And by making it scarce, it's making it more valuable. And so as a result, climate change will politicize the distribution of water. So that's our top risk, water stress, which really means the degree of competition for fresh water. It will be a global, it will be a systemic challenge that will not be tackled as such, which will make it even worse, right? You see how we will be trapped in a vicious cycle here. So demand will increase, resource will continue to decrease, and then solutions have not been a priority. So they are either lacking or too expensive or no longer adapted. So I really see 4 things happening this year on the water side. One is that you're going to see new records in terms of water-related conflicts, especially in the Middle East and in Africa. So more refugee flows, more domestic inequality, more food insecurity. You're also going to see new, what I like to call water disruptive policies, right? So especially in emerging markets. Here I'm looking at Latin America and India. So for instance, X industry, cut your water consumption by 75% tomorrow. You're going to see more of that. And then you're also going to see a backlash against the new solutions. In France, not too long ago, they were having protests against new mega reservoir because they were viewed as a way to privatize water. So you're going to see scenes with police officers that are protecting water reservoirs. Those are things that we've never really seen before. So overall, you find yourself even in a situation in 2023 where policymakers are trying but failing, where businesses are scrambling, and where communities are struggling. And so this mosaic of impact, of different impacts, unfortunately, makes water stress a good closing top risk for us this year.
Yeah, it's a real risk, the water-related conflicts that you talk about. And you just wonder, there's so much global multinational cooperation, for example, in the war in Ukraine, certainly in the West, and yet on the water issue, I don't know if there's going to be any global cooperation on that. Is there any sign on that?
There's going to be some early stages of global cooperation on it, but it's going to be very, very slow and very minimal in terms of impact. Now, to be fair, you're going to see the UN Water Conference, which is going to be the first water conference since the 70s. So I guess in and of itself, it's a pretty big deal. And it kind of like goes on to show that the topic is slowly but surely emerging as a priority, but it's very, very slow. And you will not see any kind of coordinated global roadmap of action that will come out of it. Now, to be fair, there are no quick fixes here. Whatever you do now will take years to materialize. So whether it's a surge in research and development funding, whether it's the prioritization of international negotiation on desertification, you can start the conversation today then, but you'll only see the result much later. And then we also have so many competing priorities. I mean, cue the top risk 1 to 9 so you can see.
Yeah, well, let's get into them. I'm glad you put water on there, Frank. I think it is the most undercovered issue in the mainstream media and a critical risk. Cliff, related to that is the energy crisis. I'll bring you back in. Is there any sense that the war in Ukraine or other factors may hasten the shift, the so-called transition to alternative sources, particularly in places like Europe?
Well, the war in Ukraine is kind of a split decision. In the short term, it makes developed markets worry about energy security, which means more fossil fuels. I think in the longer run, there is an awareness that dependence on fossil fuels is really risky, and that a much better way to go, in addition to a much cleaner and healthier way to go, is to have the resources on your own soil to make renewable energy. And I think especially in Europe, it was kind of like people realize that Merkel's dependence on Russia for cheap gas, and they use it and they make products, make trillions of dollars. The model doesn't work anymore, and they're going much greener. So yeah, I think the Ukraine war triple net is going to be a big force behind the green transition, not so much so in the short term.
I agree that it's a force for movement in the long term, but I also think that it is a force that is driving greater gaps between the wealthy countries in the world and the poorer countries in the world. I mean, the NATO and the G7 are fully aligned in punishing the Russians and defending the Ukrainians as a consequence of this invasion. There are virtually no developing countries in the world that are supporting that policy proactively. They're not. And it's not because they like the idea of the Russians invading Ukraine, but they really don't like the economic hit that they are taking, the burdens that they are taking on their shoulders when they know that the wealthy countries of the world would have none of this indignation, none of this policy response if this kind of an invasion was happening in sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East, or dare I say, someplace darker than Ukraine, right? I mean, the fact is that this is a European white country, and therefore the United States and Europe have decided it's utterly unacceptable for the Russians to be able to invade it. And that reality and the hypocrisy that the West has been seen and playing out for generations now in their treatment directly in other parts of the world has a whole bunch of developing countries saying, we are not going to support you for this. And what that means for all of the risks that Frank is talking about, where it's the developing countries that are facing all of the challenges on the water side and on the climate side and on the energy side and the food side and the fertilizer side, is they're saying, show me the money. Don't just show the Ukrainians the money, show me the money. And so far, that's not happening.
Well, that plays into, maybe Franck can pick up on what Ian's saying. Risk 7 is arrested global development. And I think a lot of folks don't appreciate what that means. Ian's kind of outlined it because that's very much a part of it. What does it mean, and why are the issues of climate and energy feeding into that?
Well, I mean, the problem that we're going to see after all of this is the fact that the divide between rich and poor economies is just going to keep growing. That's really Jan's point, right? So, for instance, the whole fund that they created last year on the climate side for emerging markets, people are going to ask, where's the money? And the money is going to be nowhere to be found. So that trust level between rich and poor countries is going to just be lower and lower. And then the other thing that I'm also seeing on this side is that the voices of emerging markets, though, will continue to be much louder and much more disruptive as a reaction, right? And I saw it firsthand in Montreal during the Biodiversity Cup. I think more and more they're going to kind of like coordinate and speak with one voice, and we're going to see how disruptive it's going to be in the next big conferences that are going to take place this year.
Yeah, and Frank, I know you've been following it at the UN Climate Conference in Egypt, the Biodiversity Conference in Montreal, and that's a new concept, people talking about biodiversity. Thanks, Franck Gbaguidi, that's phenomenal from water and arrested global development and energy, big parts of the risk profile for 2023. Franck Gbaguidi, thanks for that. Now, some people are just joining us, so let me just welcome you. And if you're just joining us for the Eurasia Group's Top Risks of 2023 presented by GZERO Media, we're counting down the biggest global risks of 2023 on January 3rd as we get into this new year. We're not going to get into every risk because we've only got an hour, but I urge you to read the report. But let me just quickly give you, as we count down from 10 to 1. At 10, as Frank just talked about, is water stress. Now, we've talked about that. I'm really glad that's on the list. 9 is something we call TikTok boom, the rise of Gen Z, which makes up 30% of the population and is driving change from the bottom up, especially in the workplace and in the ballot box. So we can dig into Gen Z. At 8 is the divided states of America. Of course, that was a top risk last year, a country increasingly polarized and politically dysfunctional. Then you've got arrested global development, which Ian and Frank just talked about, at risk number 7. Then you've got energy crunch at 6, which Cliff and Frank were just also digging into. At 5, Iran in a corner. Look, we're all watching Iran, the serious domestic protests there. The regime there is cracking down on its population, accelerating its nuclear program. They're supplying Russia with drones. Iran is the 5th top risk of 2023. We're going to come back to that. But let's now get into the top 5, and we'll drill down into number 4. This is a topic probably everybody watching knows about. It's been front and center, and that is, of course, inflation shockwaves. We're feeling it every day. You go to the grocery store, you feel it. Some nations are experiencing levels of inflation not seen in generations. The risk of recession hangs heavily in the air as we begin the year. Central banks, remember that term? They tried to reassure everyone, oh, this is all transitory. Maybe they were talking about geologic time, but they got it wrong. Where is it headed? Let's bring in Rob Kahn, Eurasia Group's Managing Director for Global Macro-Geoeconomics. Rob, great to see you. Happy New Year. Let's start in the U.S. and we'll move outward. The year begins with inflation hovering in the 7.5%, almost made it to double digits before stabilizing in November. The Fed is in a firefight right now. Everyone keeps asking, what's causing it and what does it mean for the economy going forward in this fear of recession?
Well, Ian, thanks for including me, and you did a great job of framing it. The inflation may have peaked in many of the major economies, but the road down is going to be slow and bumpy. There's a big food fight going on now among economists. To what extent this inflationary shock, which, as you said, really is a generational thing, to what extent is it supply and to what extent is it demand? Well, it's both. In some sense, the supply side's easier to understand. The COVID disruption was deeper and far more persistent than we thought it was going to be. And then, of course, the war crippled energy and food markets, which are so important, particularly for low-income elements of economies. But demand, no doubt, played an important role, particularly in the U.S., pouring fuel on the fire. The monetary and fiscal stimulative policies that were put in place beginning at the start of the pandemic to put a floor under activity, well motivated though they may be, really put a lot of pressure on this restricted supply. I saw one good study out of the Federal Reserve that said that in the US, 2.5 percentage points of our inflationary increase came from fiscal policy and from the excess spending relative to the available supply. That's compared to 0.5% in the UK. And it underscores that particularly in the US, fiscal policy was expansive to the extent that it added to the current challenges that we're facing now. Now, what does it mean? I think what it really means is that this disinflation is going to be hard. And except for those of us with a lot of gray hair, most people haven't had the experience of having to live through it. I think that means that markets are going to be highly volatile, sensitive to new information, and that the Fed and other central banks in particular are going to need to maintain restrictive policies, and that means interest rates higher for longer than they would otherwise want to do in order to put more material downward pressure on inflation and ensure they're not repeating the mistakes of the 1970s.
So I mean, Rob, that's the US and obviously around the world.
Yeah.
It's a macro picture, but are there specific countries and regions that are concerning for you that may drive us into a global recession?
Well, I'm certainly concerned globally. The large industrial countries are so critical for global growth. IMF head Kristalina Georgieva said over the weekend she thought 1/3 of the world will be in recession this year. I'm sorry. It's closer to 1/2 if you include the US, which I would. And so, it all matters. But if you ask me where I'm most concerned right now, it really starts and ends with the emerging markets, and particularly the commodity importing emerging markets. Why is that? They're more vulnerable. Their debt is higher. They're more subject to sudden stops of capital flows that make it harder for them to finance the policies they have in place. Their policy space, their capacity to use monetary and fiscal policy has been exhausted in response to the pandemic. And now as we enter into the fourth year, they are increasingly constrained and facing populations that are frustrated, angry, and demanding that their needs are being met more comprehensively, and they're not capable of doing it. So I see a significant risk of debt crises. I see a significant risk of high and less well anchored exchange rates. All of that suggests a lot more volatility in the year ahead is the risk.
And then you've got the top risk reports, predicting we're entering a global recession. First, I mean, you got to think, what are the global implications of that? And then governing authorities, central banks, they kind of blew it before, as you say. Maybe they had good intentions, but they added fuel to the fire. What do you expect to see on those two fronts?
Well, of course, the most immediate cost of a recession is the lost output. And in the run prior to the pandemic, we were seeing across much of the industrial world in particular, but also in emerging markets, real wage gains. We were seeing really a well-performing global economy with relatively low unemployment rates. A lot of those, and we saw income distribution narrowing in many important countries. A lot of that's been lost. And we've touched on earlier, Ian and Cliff touched on as well, that sense of disillusionment, well, not just north-south, but within economies between low-income consumers that have felt like gains are being pulled away from them. And so I certainly see both economic and political discontent at this extended period of disruption, first COVID, now recession, are really making these policy debates more divisive. Now, turning to the central bank specifically, which is something we're following quite closely, early on in this inflationary spike, there was kind of a shock across the political spectrum. There was broad, I wouldn't say uniform, but not unanimous, but there was broad bipartisan support in most countries for central banks to take a pretty tough line. And you saw the Fed, followed by ECB, Bank of England, and the like, raising rates very aggressively in order to really try and get ahead of this. I think as we head into 2023, for all the reasons we've talked about, these type of decisions are going to become far more politically divisive. Whether or not policymakers, particularly central banks, are pulling back on demand, pulling back in a way that raises the risk of recession, raises the risk of financial crisis, lowers real wages. All of that is going to become much more sharply divided politically, I think, across both the emerging and the industrial world.
Yeah, and just if you were reading the Financial Times today, our managing director for Europe for the consultancy for EG said, quote, a deeper than expected recession next year could put high deficit, high debt countries under even more pressure that would probably make for a softer path for monetary policy in the ECB. So as you say, that's kind of a real interesting dynamic playing out there.
And just to emphasize that, I mean, I'm thinking and talking more in terms of the emerging markets, but within Europe, it wasn't that long ago that we had a crisis that was caused by a diversion between the wealthier and countries of the north and the periphery countries, right, with high debt and weaker economies and higher inflation. And absolutely, I think for many more investors, the risk of that division returning is really feeds into the fear factor. You can tell yourself the banks are better capitalized. You can tell yourself that we've learned the lessons and the politics are better, but that certainly is a risk that I think you're going to see people increasingly fretting about.
Yeah, Robin, it just harkens back to a quote Cliff said in another context earlier. He said the model doesn't work anymore. Maybe the model doesn't work anymore. They got to figure out a new model. Okay, Rob Kahn, thanks for that. I really appreciate that. You for joining us on that. We are now at the top 3 risks of 2023. Soon we're going to reveal what you said was the biggest threat and risk to the world this year, and we'll see how it compares to Ian and Cliff's forecast from this year as well. But let's look at risk number 3. This could be in some ways the most interesting to me and the most surprising, Ian. It's weapons of mass disruption. It's not the first time technology or the tech sector has made it, but early on in this program, you said it's aging autocrats and tech bros. Why are weapons of mass disruption the top risk number 3 in 2023?
By the way, the tech bros are also aging autocrats. Let's be clear.
Okay,
You look at them, they're increasing.
that's fair.
That is happening. Look, we've been talking about the United States a lot over the first half an hour of the show, and in positive ways. The democracy is more resilient than people think. The economy is doing well. It's helping to stabilize the global environment. They got a lot of energy prices lower in the US than they are in Europe. They are in emerging markets. The United States defense is, of course, helping to anchor NATO in a much more significant way than was true before, and is doing the most to defend Ukraine. All sounds great, right? Glad we're in the United States. But in 1989, when the wall came down, the United States was the most important exporter of democracy in the world, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, but certainly that was the driver. That's how the wall came down. That's how the Soviet Union was defeated. It was ideology. Now, today, 30 years later, the United States has become the most important, the strongest exporter of tools that destroy democracy. And I think that is completely unappreciated or underappreciated. We all know the reality of social media being damaging, of technology companies having sovereignty in the virtual space. Nobody knows how to regulate them effectively. They make arbitrary rules that they feel like making. It can change radically on the basis of who owns it, who doesn't own it. I'm not suggesting that we like one regime or the other, or that we are playing favorites of which techno bro is our favorite. Rather, I'm saying that this business model of surveillance capitalism, this business model of maximizing profit, which has as an incidental byproduct the fundamental unraveling of the fabric of civil society, has become a principal export of America to other democracies around the world. And the ironic thing is that it is precisely the openness and the democracy of the United States that has allowed that reality to incubate and grow. And the US is not the country that's principally at risk. The countries that are principally at risk are the ones that have the most brittle institutions. They're the weakest democracies. They're the ones where, anti-establishment populists on the far right or on the far left, empowered with disinformation, social media that they can manipulate and control, disinformation can destroy democracies. And that, especially with new AI trends. And by the way, this risk, as you mentioned, Evan, is called weapons of mass disruption. It's the first time in 25 years that the name of one of our risks was ever written by an AI bot. It was actually written by ChatGPT. We didn't write it. Maybe we should have used it for other ones too, because it was pretty good as a title. But this is the year that the Turing test will be smashed by AI. And what that means is that many of us will not be able to distinguish between human beings and AI bots that are being deployed by human beings, in many cases with malevolent intent, to get us to change our actions, our views, our political orientation. That it may not be risk number 1, but my God, it's number 3 with a bullet, and it's moving fast.
Well, and you mentioned Chat GPT. A lot of people are just kind of coming to terms with what that means, the geopolitical implications of the technology? Because look, they've talked about AI and these kind of technologies as bringing opportunities and outweighing the risks, but these have huge implications. ChatGPT, just one of them, as you say, a way that it almost imitates or can be confused with a human being, a human interaction, like the Turing test. What are the implications of technology like that?
Well, first of all, it's important to understand I am not someone who opposes technological progress at all. We spend so much time talking about the upside of AI and the explosive productivity growth that's coming as a consequence. So much of the upside of climate change comes from cheaper new technologies that we're developing, and maybe even breakthroughs in areas like fusion. That's very exciting stuff. But what happens is we all spend all of our time talking about the new productivity, and no one talks about the flip side, the dangers of these disruptive technologies, until the crisis hits, until it's too late. So I view it personally as our role globally to talk about some of the things that aren't otherwise getting the global attention. And that is how we think about AI. So what kind of an example? Let me give you an example people aren't talking about. So if you're the CEO of a corporation, what happens when you or when other senior employees of your firm can be faked and manipulated by AI bots, by someone that wants to bring your company down, by a competitor, by a disgruntled employee, by someone that doesn't like your products, by people that otherwise historically would have demonstrated or would have been whistleblowers, and now instead they're supporting disinformation that literally overnight can bring masses of AI bots to drive down the price of your stock. I mean, imagine the meme stock approach of a GameStop suddenly exploded by AI disinformation. And you can see the types of sudden, staggering movements of deploy billions and billions of dollars that will destroy corporations on the basis of this technology. And that's just one example. But I'm giving you that example not because I think that's the first one that's going to hit, but because it's emblematic of so many things that people aren't thinking about in this environment.
Yeah, and there's so little consensus at all on solutions.
Right.
Just the term regulation itself creates pushback, right? So this is a very complex problem. Okay, let me hang in there because I think we're going to come back to that. That's risk number 3, but I got to get to risk number 2, and they're interrelated on all these concepts. I mean, you're talking about technology. That, of course, plays into China and the US and that interaction. And it does play into risk number 2 overall on a much bigger macro level, which is the second biggest risk of 2023, which is maximum Xi. Of course, that is China and the most powerful leader since Mao, of course, Xi Jinping. What are the risks posed by China with this new remarkably powerful leader? Let's bring in Anna Ashton, Director of China Corporate Affairs, and the US-China team at Eurasia Group. Happy New Year to you, Anna. China topped the list last year. It was number 1 top risk as the nation's economy stood on shaky ground thanks to the zero COVID policy, which is a huge issue now. This year, the risk seems less focused on policy and more on personality, and Xi Jinping, the term EG is using, maximum Xi. What does that term mean? And what, Anna, are the risks associated with maximum Xi?
Thanks, Evan. So basically the risks boil down to maximum impunity and maximum potential mistakes. When the 20th Party Congress was held last October, what became clear was that Xi Jinping has now succeeded in consolidating power like no one else in recent Chinese history, like few in the world, frankly. He's amassed power to an extent not achieved by any other modern Chinese leader except for Mao. And his command of the country is basically unrivaled. He's seated all of the top leadership posts with his own allies who are unlikely to push back on his decisions. He's going to be able to get a lot done a lot faster. Among his goals, we know, will for sure be continuing to build out the party's influence over government, business, the economy, and that may or may not always be a good thing. The big risk is that he's also less fettered in his ability to make miscalculations and mistakes. We already see that playing out with the sudden end of zero COVID. If she had a theme song right now, it'd be Drake's 0 to 100. I mean, this pivot out of zero COVID was deeply desired by many in China, but it has been really quick. And yes, maybe the outbreak was inevitable, but what people are asking is, where's the stockpile of antivirals? Where was the vaccine campaign to prepare for that inevitable outbreak? So that's a prime example of this increased risk of Xi making policy mistakes. And now he's operating with fewer constraints than ever, without checks and balances in place, without an opposition faction to contend with, and surrounded by political allies who are likely to be yes men. So his recognition of mistakes and his steps to course correct may also be delayed.
Okay, you're dropping the Drake songs too. I thought you were Drake starting from the bottom, but I like how you also dropped that Drake song too. What about domestically? Does she pose domestically? I mean, we'll get to foreign policy and the wolf diplomacy in a minute. Any real threat? I mean, we've seen these remarkable protests. Are we overplaying the notion that this is zero COVID and the protests may signal any potential change or threat to Xi's power?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a real temptation in Western media to look at the protests that we saw several weeks ago over frustration with the zero COVID policies and think that there was some groundswell of opposition to Xi that was being made manifest, but that's just not the case. There's really not much risk of a revolution or sweeping political change in China right now. The reality, as I said, is Xi Jinping has built a lot of safeguards into the system through his expansion of power and his expansion of control. And there's not an opposition faction with any real power right now that could be sort of pushed into action to organize a resistance movement or an ousting of Xi Jinping. And I think on top of that, it's important to remember that revolution also comes when life is getting worse, not better. And the idea that life is getting worse in China is something that only describes China in the narrowest of terms. Yes, COVID is bad. Yes, China's economy has slowed considerably over the course of COVID, but for most of the time that Xi's been in power, and he's been in power for more than a decade now, China has clearly thrived, and he's cultivated and shown that he can effectively rally strong nationalistic sentiments as well. So there's nothing in the cards right now that makes it look like a revolution is likely.
Yeah, Ian, I know you want to weigh in that real quick, Ian, on any instability within there because of the zero COVID, and how does that play out in Xi's wolf diplomacy? Does he sort of flex his muscles to try to distract from internal issues?
No. I mean, we all agreed that there was no instability after he secured his third term. He has more consolidation of power. Look, this is a guy who has the control of Putin, but the power of the United States like 10 years ago. Like, who put their peanut butter in my chocolate, right? I mean, you've never seen a combination like this before, okay? And the impact of that on the global economy, on the geopolitical environment is unprecedented. It really is. I mean, Mao was a horrible person he broke a lot of eggs to make his omelets, but around the world, the impact wasn't that great because China wasn't a military force that mattered back then. China wasn't important to anyone's economy back then. We weren't concerned about pandemics emerging from China back then. I mean, even just on the pandemic front, the fact that China now is the epicenter of the worst outbreak in the world, and they are completely non-transparent with the rest of the world around what's happening with it. They're not counting the cases. They're not sharing the information. We have no idea about new variants. What if they're dangerous? Are they going to tell us? No, that's a serious problem. That's an unprecedented problem. And the only thing that's staggering about Maximum Xi in this year's list is that they didn't make number one, that there was something actually worse.
Right. Just before I let you go, Anna, just quickly back to you. One of the red herring risks is Taiwan. There's a fear that there's escalating conflict there with the U.S. How's that playing out, Anna?
Well, so it is a red herring risk because the situation is not primed for China to invade Taiwan. There's very little likelihood that they would succeed. Neither our military leaders nor theirs seem to believe that that is a possibility right now. There is a shifting balance of military power in the region. and it is a thing that is driving the worries of military and political leaders here in the United States. But it is really utterly against most of China's core interests for China to invade Taiwan right now. And nothing that she has said indicates that that is the direction that they're going. He continues to reiterate that they desire peaceful long-term reunification. That being said, the United States' own rhetoric around Taiwan has been changing and getting much closer to Beijing's red lines on this issue. And I do think that we're going to see a Congress in 2023 and 2024 that pushes hard on this and is provocative with visits to Taiwan, with potentially bills that gain a lot of support, though I don't see them becoming law, to change official US policy on Taiwan and recognize its sovereignty. And that will probably push China into some sort of military action, even if it's not an invasion. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, some Pelosi provocations again. Okay, Anna Ashton, great to have you on the program today. Lots to talk about on China. That's risk number 2. But the moment is here, which is the top risk of 2023. Before we get to that, what did our viewers say was the biggest risk of the year, and how does it jibe with what Eurasia Group came up with? So here's our second poll. Let's pull that up. Which of these presents the greatest global threat in 2023? Is it Russian aggression, democracies in danger, climate change, or widening inequality? And here are the results. Widening inequality, 17%. Climate change, 20%. Democracies in danger, 25%. And the number one risk that our poll found was 38% Russian aggression. And Ian, that is in fact your top risk. And Cliff, I'll bring you both back in here. Rogue Russia, risk number 1 in 2023. Tell us why. Ian,
look at how unhappy Putin looks in that graphic, first of all. I mean, that drives a risk just by itself. Look, this has, as Cliff said, this is the biggest misjudgment made by any leader on the global stage, since we've been covering this stuff in the 90s. Unfortunately for Putin, he has no way to claw back anything like his life pre-status quo ante in February 24th. So, I mean, at least the Cuban Missile Crisis, you talk about like there's this incredible chance of Armageddon, and then both sides step back and they were able to do business as usual. That can't happen, right? He's destroyed his military. He's got an economic position, a country which is being forcibly decoupled from the West that's not coming back. NATO's expanding. Ukraine is now going to be the best trained, best armed, most effective intelligence, best, army in Europe facing Russia. And all of that is happening while Putin is failing at every one of his war aims. So what's going to happen in 2023? Well, first, Putin is going to fail on the ground in Ukraine, and it might be worse than that. Ukraine might be able to retake a lot of the land in counteroffensives that the Russians have taken, maybe even threatening to retake Crimea. Russia will increasingly not even be in a position to punish the Ukrainians the way they have in the last couple of months, because Ukrainian air defenses will get a lot more effective, especially when the Patriot missile system is stood up. So what can the Russians do unless the country is going to give up, unless they're going to simply sort of surrender, which I don't expect. And so the outcome is likely to be that Putin's going to escalate. And escalation means that the war is increasingly going to hit NATO. Asymmetric attacks, cyber, fiber, pipeline, disinformation, espionage. In other words, rogue Russia is going to look to NATO the way rogue Iran has looked to the Middle East. Russia will become the most powerful rogue state that the world has ever experienced. And the fact that we are not in a Cold War with Russia, I wish we were in a Cold War with Russia. That would be upside. We're in a hot war with Russia. And the West is trying not to admit that and is trying to limit what it does. So it's not putting troops on the ground in Ukraine. It's not doing a no-fly zone. But from the Russian perspective, they're fighting NATO. And the only question is to what extent they're going to feel forced to start bringing that fight back to NATO because they're losing, because they're doing so badly. That is, I don't see how you don't make that geopolitically the top risk on absolutely everybody's screen for the foreseeable future.
Of course, Cliff, it does raise lots of questions about mission creep. You know, the West and the US has said we're going to try to stay out to keep it from a direct hot war. And yet you wonder, Patriot missiles come, you worry about mission creep. We've seen that movie before, sadly. And we can get to that. But Cliff, can you just drill in on Putin's future and how it might play out? Because, you know, we've seen this before. You think, oh, these dictators, you know, they're solid until they're not. But look at Assad. You know, Putin's selling cheap oil to China, cheap oil to India to keep his economy rolling. How precarious is his position?
In the short to medium term, not very. I spent a lot of time around the guy. He's a very smart guy, despite making a very dumb decision, you know, last year. He will protect himself, layers of protection, the presidential guard. So I know the head of the presidential guard is very close to him, very, very loyal to him. He's surrounded himself by loyalists. It's kind of a classic militarized autocratic regime. I think that the greatest risk to him comes from, I said it before, the security services. These guys are not Fred Flintstone helmet heads. They're bright. I know one of them. Well, you spent a lot of time in Williamsburg, Virginia, learning about the U.S. tourism industry. So the common perception of the guys that surround him is really just not correct. I think the greatest risk to him over maybe a 3 to 5 year term is that one or a group of them decides that they've had enough and they, you know, dispose of him in the way they see fit. The popular element, I think, is way out there, probably in the 5 to 10 year time frame. These sanctions are not biting. You're living in Moscow, you're still living in a, you know, nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. So I think that's how I would size up the risk to him.
Two other risks real quick on that, Cliff. Let me just stay with you. Does he force Belarus, who seem to clearly, it's not in their interests to get in? Does he widen the war? And in your view, is there an end game here, Cliff?
Does he widen the war is a tough one. On balance, I think they'll open some sort of a northern front this year, but probably without Belarusian soldiers, because it would cause you know, he's had risks with Lukashenko over the years, God knows. I think this would cause a seismic risk. The Belarusians really don't want to enter the war. Is there a solution? How does this end? I don't think it ends as long as Putin's alive. I think it's kind of like a West Bank thing, Israel, West Bank. They both want the same land, and it's very difficult to have a long-lasting solution. You know, there'll be ceasefires that fail. There'll be peace deals that fail, but I don't think this thing ends, and it's really important. It's a long-term irritant to geopolitics and markets in Europe, at least, if not the world.
Maybe more. Just Ian, on that front, yeah, irritant may be the understatement of the day here. But Ian, on that, just on the war end, flip it from the Zelensky perspective. Is there an end game that the Ukrainians see? Because, you know, Zelensky's saying, look, there's no end game. Even we'll take Crimea, which even for the West has been a red line. What's their end game?
It's important to recognize that Zelensky and NATO have very aligned strategic perspectives right now, but not in any way identical. And the United States in particular really wants the alliance to stay together. And so to the extent that there is going to be any daylight between the US and Ukraine going forward, they don't want that daylight to in any way jeopardize the unity of NATO, which is an enormously important thing. So how do you nudge the Ukrainians into the outcome that you want and reduce the likelihood of escalation that spirals out of control with the Russians, while not undermining your relationship with Ukraine and weakening the alliance? So far, what the West and the US in particular have chosen to do has been to slow roll some of the military support that they are giving the Ukrainians while giving them maximum diplomatic coverage. In other words, telling the Ukrainians, hey, when you decide to engage with diplomacy, it's completely on you, 100%. You will decide the terms. We'll have no influence. We'll just support you. But But, oh, you want those Patriot systems? Well, that's going to take some time. And the ammunition, well, we're going to give you some. We're not going to give you everything. Long range, don't want to give you everything long range, right? But what they're trying to do is help the Ukrainians take back their territory, but not give them the capacity to launch deep strikes into Russian territory, or even particularly to take back Crimea, which, I mean, right, diplomatically, the United States would completely support the idea that Crimea is Ukrainian territory. It was taken, it was annexed illegally by Russia, but there's no one inside the United States that thinks it's a good idea for the Ukrainians to have the military capabilities and the political intention to take that territory, because it could lead to nuclear war. If you're Zelensky and your economy has just contracted, not by the 4% of Russia in 2022, but by 40%, and there's a lot greater threats to Zelensky's ability to stay in power still than there is to Putin, because of that economic reality, because of the military reality, because of the need to try to keep together a country that's fighting courageously against an invading country that's so much more powerful than they are. I mean, Zelensky's fighting for life right now. And his willingness to take risks that the Americans far away would consider intemperate, but the Ukrainians, with 8 million refugees and tens of thousands of war crimes committed against them, think are absolutely the only thing they could be doing, never mind demanding reparations and, war crimes trials and all the rest. Of course, that's a reasonable thing for the Ukrainians to ask for, but it's not a reasonable thing for the Americans to provide. And in 2023, we will start to see more tensions, more pressure on that, not to divide the alliance. I don't think that's going to happen, but certainly to make the potential for escalation greater on both sides.
All right. We got a couple minutes left. Cliff, let me just go back to you. Ian compared rogue Russia modeling itself kind of like Iran on steroids. But we've seen the protests. Just real quick, if I can, main risk to watch in Iran, Cliff?
The main risk is if Supreme Leader Khamenei dies. They're in uncharted territory. There's a very opaque and not established succession process. Will the Rev Guards use the opportunity to turn Iran into a garden variety military dictatorship? The risk would be that they're much more aggressive in the region. I think that's real.
Okay, let me quickly go back. We're looking at the battle over a Republican speaker today. Ian, U.S. came down further. It's risk number 8. I guess a constitutional crisis has been averted. I should just say that if you read the report, there is a mention of the country where I come from, Canada, which was interesting to see. It seems that there is a connected issue there. What's your quick read on the U.S. constitutional crisis, quote unquote, and why you decided to rope in Canada?
Well, first, I want to congratulate the Republicans. We've not seen a second vote on House speakership since 1923. So we're going to be making history in short order in the United States. It's always great to see that happen in my country. So congratulations to the GOP. More broadly, the fact that the United States is so politically divided is something, as I mentioned before, that's being exported around the world. And that export is not just happening to weaker democracies in emerging markets and the developing world, but also, of course, even to our neighbor to the north, Canada. The fact is that even though Canada has a much more robust social contract than the United States, Canada also has a very divided country, very divided geographically, very divided politically. And Canada's media space, as you know well, Evan, its social media space is increasingly as dysfunctional and polarized as the American media and social media space. That led to a lot of disinformation and disruption, economic disruption and violence when we had the truckers' strikes and riots that occurred last year. It's happened with, even some nut job bringing arms to go after Trudeau last year. Not the kind of thing we expect with our friendly neighbors to the north. We're going to see more of that. And increasingly, I think that the connections between the United States and Canada that stitch the two countries together are going to have more to do with far right meaning far right between Alberta and Texas, far left meaning far left between, political members of Ontario and New York, than it is between the federal capitals of the two countries. And that's a danger to be avoided, but it's also a structural reality that is increasing.
Yeah, and it goes back to one of the risks, weapons of mass disruption. Okay, we are at the hour and we have managed to chew through a lot of the top risks. There are lots of red herrings that are in the report, but Ian and Cliff, Anna, Franck, I hope we can bring them all back here. Rob, thank all of you for getting through 1 hour like this. A reminder to all of you watching, check out the full list of the risks. Read the complete report by heading to eurasiagroup.net. Check out that report. The report is phenomenal. You can compare it to the 2022 report, eurasiagroup.net. If you want to keep up with the latest news and analysis on the global stories shaping the world all year long, sign up for our daily newsletter. It's called Signal. It is free. Very little is free in the world. Signal is right now. It does give you the daily insight into the top risks and stories of the day. Yeah, I think it's the best read you can get to understand the world around you every day. And many of the people you heard today are involved in it. Make sure you follow us at GZERO Media on social media. Catch Ian on his syndicated PBS show, which is phenomenal, GZERO World. Got a new episode coming this coming week. Every week he sits down with the most important thinkers and political players, dissects the issues of the day. Check your local listings on that. It is on PBS. But I'm Evan Solomon, the publisher of GZERO. For all of us at Eurasia Group and GZERO, I want to thank the team, Tony and Nolan, and everyone who put together today's show. Thanks so much. Everybody who put together Top Risks. You have no idea how many people are involved in Top Risks. Willis, Sebastian, Cliff, Ian. It's a great team. Thank you, all of you, for taking part of it. Anna, and your team as well. Thank you for watching. Have a wonderful year. We hope you didn't scare you into the year. There's a lot of top risks. Remember, politics first. Everything is political. And we'll see you soon. Thanks for watching.